On a quiet evening in a dimly lit city park, a 66-year-old retired black army nurse takes her loyal dog out for their nightly walk. But the calm shatters when three men emerge from the shadows, their eyes sharp with predatory intent and their whispers heavy with menace. They think she is just an easy target, a frail, older woman with nowhere to run. What they don't know is that she has faced danger before, and with her dog by her side, she's more than ready to face it again. In the quiet space of a peaceful and deserted evening, there was a special couple going for a walk. An elderly black woman and her loyal dog. Angela Hayes adjusted her scarf as the cool night air wrapped around her. The streets of Rosewood were quiet, too quiet for her liking. It wasn't always like this. She remembered a time when the neighborhood felt safe for children playing outside, families enjoying evening walks, laughter echoing down the sidewalks. But things had changed. After a string of break-ins and robberies, people started locking their doors earlier, leaving the streets empty long before nightfall. Still, Angela refused to let fear dictate her life. Beside her, Shadow walked with his usual confidence. His large frame moved with purpose, and his sharp eyes scanned the surroundings. Angela glanced down at him and smiled. "Looks like it's just us again, huh, boy?" she said, her voice soft but steady. Shadow's ears perked up at her voice, and he let out a low, reassuring huff. Angela had adopted Shadow 2 years ago after he retired from the police force. She knew he wasn't just a pet, he was a protector. Shadow had been trained to take down criminals, sniff out danger, and never back down. Angela had seen glimpses of that training in how he responded to noises, his alertness, and his unwavering loyalty. She trusted him completely. As they walked through the park, Angela took a deep breath, letting the familiar scent of damp grass and earth calm her nerves. She enjoyed these walks, a chance to clear her mind and enjoy the solitude. But tonight felt different. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, uneven shadows. The wind whispered through the trees, but there was something else, something that made her grip Shadow's leash a little tighter. Ahead, 3 men stood clustered under one of the flickering streetlights. They were talking in low voices, their heads close together. Angela slowed her steps, her instincts flaring. Shadow stopped, his body tensing as his eyes locked onto the group. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "It's okay, boy," Angela whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure if she believed it herself. She straightened her shoulders and kept walking, refusing to show any sign of fear. One of the men noticed her first. He nudged his friend and gestured in her direction. "Look at this," he said, his voice carrying in the still night. "Grandma out here walking her guard dog." Angela kept her eyes forward, pretending not to hear, but her heart pounded. The tallest of the 3, a man with a shaved head and a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. "Hey lady," he called out. "Nice dog. Bet he's expensive." Shadow growled louder, stepping slightly in front of Angela. "Easy, Shadow," she murmured, her voice steady. She met the man's gaze, refusing to let him intimidate her. "Can I help you with something?" The man grinned, flashing yellowed teeth. "Yeah, actually, you can," he said, taking another step closer. "Why don't you hand over your purse and your phone? Oh, and don't forget the dog. He looks like he'd sell for a pretty penny." Angela's stomach tightened, but her voice remained calm. "I think you've got the wrong idea," she said. "I'm just out for a walk. Why don't you step aside and let me pass?" The man laughed, and his friends joined in. "You hear that, guys? She thinks she's got a choice." The second man, shorter and stockier, reached into his jacket and pulled out a knife. Its blade glinted in the dim light. "We're not asking, lady." Shadow barked, sharp and commanding, the sound cutting through the laughter like a knife. The man with the knife flinched, but the leader stepped closer. "You better call off your mutt before things get ugly," he said, his grin fading. Angela tightened her grip on Shadow's leash. Her mind raced, calculating her options. She couldn't outrun them, and even if she tried, they wouldn't let her get far. Shadow was trained, but 3 against 1 even for him was a dangerous fight. "I'm warning you," she said, her voice steel. "You don't want to do this." The leader's grin returned, but this time it was colder. "I think we do." And then, everything happened at once. The man with the knife lunged forward, but Shadow was faster. With a snarl, he leapt, his jaws clamping down on the man's arm. The knife clattered to the ground as the man screamed, trying to shake Shadow off. Angela took a step back, her heart pounding as adrenaline flooded her veins. The leader shouted, charging toward Shadow, but Angela reacted without thinking. She reached into her bag, pulled out a can of pepper spray, and aimed it directly at his face. The man stumbled back, cursing and clawing at his eyes. "You crazy old hag," he yelled, but Angela didn't back down. The third man hesitated, his eyes darting between his friends and Shadow, who was still holding the first man down. Angela pointed the pepper spray at him. "Don't even think about it," she warned. For a moment he froze. Then he turned and bolted, disappearing into the night. The leader, still rubbing his eyes, tried to run, but Shadow released the first man and lunged at him, knocking him to the ground. Angela's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. "Yes, I need police assistance at Rosewood Park," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "I was attacked, but my dog stopped them. They're down, but I need officers here now." By the time the dispatcher confirmed help was on the way, Shadow had both men pinned, growling low and menacingly whenever they tried to move. Angela crouched down beside him, her hand resting lightly on his back. "Good boy," she whispered. "Good boy." The sound of sirens broke the tension, their wails cutting through the night. Angela exhaled slowly, relief washing over her, but her eyes never left the two men lying on the pavement. "You messed with the wrong woman," she muttered under her breath. Shadow wagged his tail slightly, his eyes still locked on the men, as if to say, "And the wrong dog." Angela Hayes stood her ground as the flashing red and blue lights washed over the darkened park. Shadow remained tense, his muscular frame still coiled and ready to spring into action if necessary. The two men sprawled on the ground. Trey Harris and Damon Reed groaned as they shielded their eyes from the harsh glare of the approaching squad cars. The sound of slamming car doors echoed as Officer Darrell Lewis stepped out, his sharp eyes immediately scanning the scene. Angela exhaled, relief flooding her chest. Darrell wasn't just any cop, he was a longtime friend, someone who had earned Angela's trust over the years. He moved with purpose, his hand resting lightly on the grip of his holstered weapon as he approached. "Angela?" he called, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "Over here, Darrell," she replied, her voice calm but firm. Shadow stood protectively by her side, his eyes locked on the men on the ground. Darrell took one look at the situation, the knife lying nearby, the trembling thug pinned under Shadow's watchful gaze, and the pepper spray residue glistening on Trey's reddened face, and immediately pieced it together. "You okay?" he asked, stepping closer. "I'm fine," Angela said, "but these two thought they could make me an easy target." She gestured at Trey and Damon. Turns out they had no idea who they were dealing with. Darrell's lips twitched as if he was suppressing a smile, but his focus quickly shifted to the suspects. "What the hell were you thinking?" he barked at Trey, who squirmed but said nothing. Damon clutched his arm, wincing in pain where Shadow's teeth had left clear indentations. Two more officers, one younger and another slightly older, stepped out of their vehicle and quickly moved to secure the scene. The older officer nodded at Shadow. "That's some dog you've got there, ma'am." "Former K-9, Angela said, scratching behind Shadow's ears as he relaxed just slightly. "Still knows how to handle himself." "You can say that again," the younger officer muttered as he carefully retrieved the knife and bagged it as evidence. Darrell crouched near Trey, pulling his wrists behind his back and snapping on a pair of handcuffs. "You're under arrest for assault and attempted robbery," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "Assault," Trey snapped, coughing from the lingering pepper spray. "She's the one who attacked us. That dog's out of control." "Out of control," Angela repeated, stepping closer. "You pulled a knife on me, Trey. What exactly were you expecting to happen?" "A handshake." Darrell shot Trey a look that silenced him before he could retort. "I'd watch what you say, Harris. We'll let the cameras and witnesses tell the story." Damon, meanwhile, had stopped struggling entirely. His head hung low, his breathing shallow as the younger officer cuffed him as well. "It wasn't supposed to go like this," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely above a whisper. Darrell stood, his eyes sharp as he turned to Angela. You said 3 men. Angela nodded. The third one ran. Skinny guy, probably mid-20s. He took off down 5th Street. The older officer spoke into his radio, relaying the description. We'll sweep the area, he said. He won't get far. Angela finally relaxed, letting go of the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Shadow leaned into her leg, his tail wagging slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. Darryl walked over, lowering his voice. You sure you're okay? That could have gone bad fast. Angela gave him a look. You know me, Darryl. I'm not one to go down without a fight. Darryl chuckled, shaking his head. You never are, but still you need to be careful out here. These guys are getting bolder. Angela's face hardened. Then maybe it's time someone reminded them whose neighborhood this is. Darryl nodded. We'll get these 2 processed and keep you updated. But Angela, he glanced at Shadow. You should probably think twice about walking alone at night, even with him. Angela smirked. Darryl, you of all people should know Shadow, and I don't scare easy. As the officers hauled Trey and Damon to their feet, Angela couldn't help but notice how much smaller they looked now. Their earlier bravado had completely crumbled, leaving behind nothing but fear and humiliation. The younger officer shot her a glance. Mom, you're going to need to come down to the station to give a full statement. I'll be there, Angela said firmly. Darryl gestured toward his car. I can give you a ride. Angela shook her head. No need. I'll get there myself. I'm not letting these fools make me change my routine. Darryl didn't argue. He knew better. I'll see you there then. Angela watched as the officers loaded the suspects into the back of their patrol cars. She crouched down next to Shadow, running her hand through his thick fur. Good boy, she whispered. You saved us tonight. Shadow wagged his tail and leaned into her touch. Angela stood and looked back toward the park entrance. She wasn't naive. This incident was just one example of a larger problem. Rosewood was changing, and not for the better. But as long as she had Shadow by her side, she wasn't backing down. Gathering her composure, she turned and began walking toward home. Shadow followed, his steps steady and sure, his head held high. The fight might have been over for now, but Angela knew this was only the beginning. Angela Hayes stepped into the brightly lit police station, the hum of activity pressing in around her. Officers moved back and forth, phones rang, and the hum of quiet conversations filled the air. Despite the bustle, Angela walked with purpose, her back straight, her expression calm but unyielding. Shadow padded beside her, his nails clicking softly against the tiled floor. Officer Darryl Lewis met her at the entrance to the bullpen. He gave a quick nod, then leaned down to give Shadow a gentle pat on the head. Good boy, he murmured before straightening. The interview room's ready. I'll sit in with you while you give your statement. Angela tilted her head, giving him a look that made it clear she wasn't interested in being coddled. Darryl, I've testified in courtrooms with far scarier faces than these rookies running around here. She glanced at a young officer fumbling with a coffee cup. I'll be fine. Darryl chuckled but didn't step aside. Still, humor me. She didn't argue. Instead, she gestured for Shadow to sit by the door and followed Darryl into the small interview room. The space smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. Angela sat down, folding her hands on the table, her sharp eyes following Darryl as he set up a recorder and notepad. Ready when you are, he said. Angela took a deep breath and began. She recounted the events with precise detail from the moment she spotted the 3 men, to their taunts, threats, and the flash of the knife. She described how Shadow had reacted, his movements swift and deliberate, and how she'd used her pepper spray to disarm one of the attackers. Darryl listened without interrupting, though his jaw tightened as she described Trey pulling out the blade. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled. Hell, Angela. That could have gone south real fast. Angela's lips pressed into a thin line. It didn't. Because of Shadow, Darryl pointed out, and because you didn't freeze up, but most people wouldn't have walked away from something like that. Angela met his gaze evenly. That's because most people don't have a dog like Shadow or my years of training. But what about everyone else? What happens when someone without a shadow crosses paths with punks like Trey? Darryl didn't answer right away. Instead, he tapped his pen against his notepad, his expression darkening. That's what we need to fix." Before Angela could respond, there was a knock at the door. The younger officer from earlier, Officer Carson, poked his head inside. "Sorry to interrupt, but we got the third guy, Eli Turner." Darrell stood quickly. "Where?" "Picked him up near the bus stop on 5th, Carson said. "Looks scared out of his mind. Claims he didn't want to hurt anyone, just got caught up with the wrong crowd." Angela snorted. "He didn't seem so scared when he was circling behind me." Darrell glanced at her. "Mind if I talk to him first? He might open up." Angela nodded. "Go. But don't let him spin too many excuses." Darrell left, and Angela sat back, glancing at the mirrored window on the wall. She knew someone was probably watching, but she didn't care. Her mind was already racing ahead, thinking about what needed to happen next. 15 minutes later, Darrell returned. His expression was a mix of frustration and intrigue. "Well?" Angela asked. "He's talking," Darrell said. "Claims Trey pressured him into it. Said Damon was the one who brought the knife and that he didn't think it would go that far." Angela raised an eyebrow. "And you believe him?" Darrell hesitated. "Not entirely. But I think he's scared enough to cooperate. If he testifies against Trey and Damon, it could help nail them both." Angela considered this. "So what now?" Darrell sat back down. "Now we file the charges and get this to the DA. With the security footage and your statement, plus Ely flipping, we've got a solid case." Angela's shoulders relaxed slightly, but the fire in her eyes didn't dim. "Good. But this doesn't end here, Darrell. You and I both know these streets aren't as safe as they used to be." Darrell sighed. "You're right. It's getting worse, especially around Rosewood." "That's why we need more than just arrests," Angela said, leaning forward. "We need prevention patrols that actually mean something. Programs for kids before they fall in with guys like Trey." Darrell rubbed the back of his neck. "You sound like you're running for office." Angela smirked. "No, I'm just someone who's tired of watching this neighborhood fall apart. And if you're smart, you'll get behind me on this." Darrell nodded. "I'm already there." Angela stood, gathering her things. "Good. Now let's make sure these charges stick." She opened the door and whistled for Shadow, who immediately trotted over. Darrell followed her out, and the two of them walked through the station, past rows of desks, and officers who couldn't help but glance their way. As Angela reached the exit, Darrell called after her. "Angela." She turned, one hand on the door. "Be careful," he said, his tone softer this time. "You're tough, but even you're not invincible." Angela smiled, her eyes flicking down at Shadow before returning to Darrell. "With him by my side, I just might be." And with that, she stepped out into the night, Shadow following closely, his ears perked and his eyes sharp. She knew this wasn't the end, far from it. But she also knew one thing for certain: she and Shadow weren't done fighting for their neighborhood. Not by a long shot. Many days later, Angela Hayes sat stiffly at the long oak table in the city's community hall, her fingers resting lightly on Shadow's head as he sat obediently beside her. The room was filled with Murmur's neighbors, reporters, and local officials gathered to witness what many already suspected would be a turning point for Rosewood. Officer Darrell Lewis stood at the front, flanked by the police chief and a member of the district attorney's office. The tension in the room was palpable. The recent attack on Angela had shaken the community, but it had also ignited something in urgency, a need for answers. And tonight, the people wanted more than apologies, they wanted action. Darrell cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming on such short notice. As many of you are aware, an incident occurred 3 nights ago involving a violent attempted robbery against one of our own Ms. Angela Hayes." Eyes turned toward her. Angela straightened in her chair, keeping her expression calm even as her pulse quickened. She hadn't come here to be pitied, she had come to make sure this moment counted. Darrell continued. "Thanks to Ms. Hayes' quick thinking and the courageous actions of her dog, Shadow, the suspects Trevor Harris and Damon Reed were detained and are now facing multiple charges, including assault with a deadly weapon, attempted robbery, and resisting arrest." A murmur rippled through the crowd, satisfaction mixed with simmering anger. Angela caught the gaze of her daughter, Nia, who sat a few rows back. Her eyes were sharp with determination, and Angela knew she was already thinking about the legal battle ahead. Daryl pressed on. The third suspect, Eli Turner, has agreed to cooperate with law enforcement. His testimony has already proven crucial in building the case against Harrison Reed. Angela's eyes narrowed slightly. She didn't trust Eli, not yet. But if his cooperation helped put Trey and Damon away, she'd take it. While we commend Ms. Hayes and Shadow for their bravery, Daryl said, this incident also highlights the need for stronger measures to protect our community. And that's what tonight is about: accountability and reform. Angela leaned back slightly, her fingers brushing against Shadow's fur. This was the part she had been waiting for. The police chief stepped forward. We recognize that what happened was not an isolated event. Crime in this area has been steadily rising, and it's clear we need to do more. Effective immediately, we are implementing an expanded neighborhood patrol program, increasing officer presence during peak hours. Additionally, we will be re-evaluating our response protocols to better address violent incidents. Angela's eyebrows lifted slightly. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. She raised her hand. The chief hesitated, then nodded. Miss Chess? Angela stood slowly. I appreciate the changes you're proposing, Chief, but I think we all know more is needed. Her voice carried through the room, steady and commanding. What happened to me could have happened to anyone, and let's be honest. Not everyone has a dog like Shadow watching their back. Several people chuckled nervously, but Angela didn't smile. This isn't just about patrols, she continued. It's about prevention. It's about giving our kids a better path than running with the wrong crowd. It's about making sure our officers are trained not just to react but to de-escalate before violence starts. And it's about holding people accountable, not just the criminals, but the system that let them think they could get away with it in the first place. The crowd erupted into applause. Nia nodded approvingly, and Daryl's lips twitched into a half-smile. The police chief cleared his throat. Miss Hayes, I'm not finished, Angela interrupted, and the chief froze. Shadow let out a low rumble, not threatening but enough to make everyone take notice. We need more than promises, Angela said. We need action. I'm calling for the formation of a civilian oversight committee, one that has real authority to monitor police conduct, review complaints, and ensure transparency. Murmurs of agreement spread through the room. And we need programs for the kids in this neighborhood: mentorships, after-school activities, job training, something that gives them hope and opportunity instead of leaving them to fall into the same traps as Trey and Damon. The applause grew louder. The chief shifted uncomfortably. Ms. Hayes, these are important ideas, but they'll take time to. Then let's start now, Angela cut in. Because I don't plan to sit around waiting for someone else to fix this. I've seen too many promises fade into nothing. And I won't let this be one of them. Nia stood up, her voice clear. As a member of the legal community, I support my mother's proposals. I'll personally assist in drafting the framework for the oversight committee. The room erupted into cheers, and for the first time, Angela allowed herself to breathe. She glanced at Shadow, who sat calmly by her side, his eyes scanning the crowd as if still standing guard. Daryl stepped forward again. We hear you, Ms. Hayes. And I'll make sure the department hears you too. Angela nodded, satisfied for now. But she knew this was only the beginning. The battle for justice and reform was far from over. As the meeting wrapped up, Angela found herself surrounded by neighbors offering words of support. Reporters asked for comments, and Shadow posed patiently for photos, his head held high. But as Angela walked out of the hall and into the night, she felt the weight of the work still ahead. Shadow stayed close, his presence a steady reminder that no matter how hard the fight, she wasn't alone. And as they passed the park where it all began, Angela stopped for just a moment, staring at the shadows cast by the streetlights. The fear she'd felt that night still lingered, but so did something else: a fire, a purpose. Come on, Shadow, she said, her voice steady. We've got work to do. Shadow wagged his tail and fell into step beside her. Together they disappeared into the quiet streets of Rosewood, ready for whatever came next. Angela Hayes sat in her living room, sunlight streaming through the window as Shadow rested at her feet. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind: media interviews, community meetings, and countless phone calls. Her body was still sore from the confrontation, but her spirit was unshaken. She had faced danger head-on, and now she was determined to make sure no one else in Rosewood had to go through what she did. The knock on her door broke her thoughts. Shadow lifted his head, ears perked, but relaxed when Angela opened the door to see Darrell Lewis standing there, his uniform crisp but his eyes tired. "Darrell," Angela said, stepping aside to let him in. "I was wondering when you'd stop by." Darrell gave a faint smile and nodded at Shadow, who greeted him with a wag of his tail. "Figured it was time we talked in private." He paused, rubbing the back of his neck. "You really stirred things up, Angela. Half the department's talking about you, and not just because of Shadow." Angela crossed her arms. "Good. That means they're paying attention." Darrell nodded and lowered himself onto the couch. "They are. But I need to be honest with you. There's resistance. The Oversight Committee proposal. The union's already gearing up to fight it." Angela wasn't surprised. She had expected pushback, but she also wasn't intimidated. "Let them fight," she said. "We'll fight harder." Darrell looked at her, and for the first time she saw something deeper conflict. He wanted to support her, but he also knew the system from the inside. It wasn't built to change easily. "Angela, you have no idea how much I respect what you're doing," he said, leaning forward. "But I need you to be prepared. This isn't just about paperwork and meetings. You're talking about challenging a culture, a way of thinking that's been rooted in law enforcement for decades." Angela sat down across from him. "Darrell, I've faced tougher battles than this. I spent years in the military patching up soldiers who didn't think they'd make it home. I've seen the worst humanity has to offer, and I've come out stronger every time. This fight, it's one I'm ready for." Darrell smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "Then I'm with you. Whatever you need, I'll be there." Angela extended her hand, and Darrell shook it firmly. A week later, Angela stood in front of the crowd at another town hall, this time not as a victim but as a leader. Nia stood to her left, holding a stack of legal documents, and Darrell stood to her right, dressed in plain clothes instead of his uniform. The room buzzed with energy. The story of Angela and Shadow had spread far beyond Rosewood. Media outlets had dubbed her the Guardian of Rosewood, and Shadow had become a local celebrity, appearing on news segments and social media posts. But Angela wasn't here for fame. She was here for change. Angela stepped up to the microphone, her voice steady. "We've come a long way since that night in the park," she began. "And while I'm grateful for all the support I've received, this isn't about me. It's about all of us." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Rosewood deserves better. Safer streets, a police department we can trust, and opportunities for our youth. That's why tonight we're taking the first step toward real reform." She gestured toward Nia, who handed her the documents. "This," Angela said, holding up the papers, "is the proposal for the Rosewood Civilian Oversight Committee. This group, made up of community members, will have the power to review police actions, handle complaints, and ensure transparency. It's not just a promise, it's a plan." Applause erupted, but Angela wasn't finished. "And that's not all," she continued. "Thanks to the work of Officer Darrell Lewis and others who believe in change, we're also pushing for mandatory de-escalation training, community outreach programs, and new initiatives to keep our kids off the streets and out of trouble." The crowd cheered again, but Angela raised her hand to quiet them. "This isn't going to be easy," she said. "There will be obstacles. There will be people who want to keep things the way they are. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that courage doesn't mean you're not afraid, it means you stand up anyway." Angela looked down at Shadow, who sat calmly beside her. And sometimes courage comes with 4 legs and a wagging tail. The room erupted in laughter and applause. In the weeks that followed, the Oversight Committee was officially approved by the City Council. Shadow was awarded a special medal for bravery, presented in a small ceremony at the police station. Angela stood by his side as the chief pinned the medal to his collar, and Shadow wagged his tail as if he knew exactly what it meant. But the real work was just beginning. Angela became a fixture at city meetings, working with Nia and Darrell to push reforms through. Trey and Damon were sentenced to prison, and Ely, true to his word, testified, helping to build a stronger case against them. Angela even took time to meet with Eli privately, offering him a chance to join a job training program instead of following the same path that had led him to that night in the park. "You've got a second chance," she told him. "Don't waste it." He promised he wouldn't. One evening, Angela and Shadow walked through the park, the same path where it all began. But this time, the park felt different, safer. Parents played with their kids, teenagers shot hoops, and neighbors greeted each other with smiles instead of wary glances. Angela stopped at a new plaque near the bench where she had first seen Trey and his crew. It read, "In honor of Angela Hayes and Shadow, for their bravery and commitment to justice. Rosewood stands stronger because of them." Angela ran her fingers over the engraving and smiled. "Looks like you made history, Shadow," she said. Shadow wagged his tail and nudged her hand. Angela looked out over the park, taking in the sight of her community coming together. She knew the fight wasn't over, there would always be more to do. But for now, she let herself enjoy the victory. "Come on, boy," she said, tugging lightly on his leash. "Let's go home." And as they walked off into the fading sunlight, Shadow trotted beside her, her partner, her protector, and her reminder that even in the darkest moments, courage and loyalty could light the way.